Texas and Georgia are the two favorites to win the SEC this year, but in my opinion, there are no clear favorites to win this conference. The SEC is as wide open going into this season as it's ever been. Georgia has 3 tough road games against Texas, Ole Miss, and Alabama. It's definitely fair to see them losing at least 2 of those games. When you look at Ole Miss, they got a really good roster. You play Georgia at home, and you got one of the more favorable schedules in this conference. The best team isn't always going to win the conference title because it's also going to come down to your schedule. And we've seen teams as good as Georgia lose tough games on the road to teams like Texas and Ole Miss and Alabama in the past. Hell, look at Alabama 2 years ago when they had that 2-loss season. They lost to LSU and Tennessee. They lost those games on the road. You can be a better team, but if you're playing somebody on the road, that definitely is an advantage for the inferior opponent. Texas, even they have a couple of tough games. This is going to be a year that anybody can win the SEC. You don't need to have a stacked roster to do so when everybody in the SEC is just about on the same talent scale. Now, are you as good as what Georgia and Texas are? No, but you're not too far off. Texas A&M still has a top 10 roster. So does Alabama. And you can say the same thing with Ole Miss based on how well they've used the transfer portal combined with recruiting. Hell, even LSU, Tennessee, Oklahoma, they have a shot to win the SEC this year. Oklahoma has recruited at a really high level. We know how good of a head coach Brian Kelly is. Although they did kind of disappoint last year, they still had a very successful season. If I had to bet on who is going to win this conference, I wouldn't place any. Because it's just so hard to predict how the SEC is going to go this year. You have so many talented teams with so many good coaches that there's not a clear favorite. And I see it being this way for the foreseeable future. Every once in a while, we may have a team that's just so good that we know they're just going to run the table on this conference. But Texas and Georgia are juggernauts. Same thing with Alabama. I'm willing to bet that Texas and Georgia don't end up winning the SEC this year. One of them may make it to the conference championship game, but that doesn't mean they're going to win it. I definitely could see Alabama winning it year 1 under Kalen DeBoer. Kalen DeBoer is the second best head coach in college football to me. There's not a single head coach in the country that's won more with less than Kalen DeBoer. He's 10-1 against top 25 teams. He mopped the floor with Dan Lanning, who's one of the best ascending young coaches in the sport. And he took Washington to the national championship in the span of 2 years and had more success during that span than what guys such as Chris Peterson had, spending way more time with Washington. Hell, when Jimmy Lake took over, he damn near ran that program to the ground, and Kalen DeBoer came and saved it. Mike Elko, he was doing more with less at Duke. And they got a really good quarterback in Connor Wigman. They should have one of the better defenses in the SEC this year. What about Tennessee? They got arguably the best defensive line in college football. You return 3 out of 5 starters on the offensive line. You got a really deep wide receiving core where you had a lot of injuries at that position last year. You got those guys coming back fully healthy. Plus, you added more depth. You got Nico Imaviava taking over at quarterback, who is a highly talented recruit coming out of high school. He should be an upgrade from what you had when it came to Joe Milton last year. The SEC is wide open, and I don't think this is a conference that you can just say comes down to Texas and Georgia. It's the Wild Wild West this year in the Southeastern Conference. I'm not going to be betting on any futures bet when it comes to who's going to win this thing, at least not putting it on one team. If I have to bet on who is going to win the SEC, I will put it on Georgia, Alabama, Ole Miss, Tennessee, or Oklahoma. There's like 5 or 7 teams this year that could win the SEC. You don't have to be as talented as Texas and Georgia to do so. As long as you have a top 10 roster from a talent standpoint, good quarterback play, and a favorable schedule, you can make it into the SEC championship. Let's say Ole Miss only has one loss to Georgia, but Georgia has two losses because they lost to Alabama, and let's say, they beat Ole Miss, but they also dropped another game to, let's say, Texas on the road. It's hard to win on the road in Texas. You saw Nick Saban, Alabama, with Bryce Young. They nearly lost to Texas on the road in Austin. That's a tough environment to play. You're playing 3 tough road games and 3 of the most difficult places to win on the road in college football. So it's definitely not insane to see Georgia being a 2-loss team. Meanwhile, you could have a 1-loss Ole Miss that, although they lost to Georgia, they still got into the SEC championship because they had less conference losses than what Georgia had. With conference realignment, oversaturating these conferences and making them just so stacked where you got so many good coaches, so many top 10 teams from a talent standpoint, it's going to be hard finding a clear favorite every single year. Could there be a team that runs the table and goes undefeated? Yeah, but I'm not expecting that to happen this season. There very well could be an SEC champion that has 2 losses this year in conference play. Hell, Georgia could miss the SEC conference championship and still win it all this year. I'm not saying that Georgia and Texas are overrated. What I'm telling you is that the SEC is so stacked with how many good teams there are and with the way these schedules are aligned. For you to truly be able to win this thing and go undefeated, you need some breaks in the schedule. And having to play 3 tough road games like Georgia has to, it's really hard to see them making it to the SEC championship this year, despite how talented they are. Because in college football, you could be a more talented team than the team you're playing against on the road, but home field advantage definitely has a big impact on deciding the wins and losses. I think a SEC champion that we crowned this year is not going to be named Texas or Georgia, and that's my bold prediction for this college football season.